It's a pleasure to be here, and let me say, as a proud Pennsylvanian, it's a pleasure to take part in your first hearing as chairman. Politicians, myself included, always talk about American exceptionalism. We talk about it, but I believe we've mostly recently given lip service to the term American exceptionalism. We can't be an exceptional country without a first-class infrastructure. And let the record show we don't have one anymore. In 2005, the World Economic Forum ranked the U.S. infrastructure #1 in the world. Now, 8 years later, we rank 14th in the same study. Our air transport infrastructure ranks 30th in the world, behind countries like Panama and Malaysia. Our port infrastructure ranks 19th in the world, behind countries like Estonia and Latvia. It's no surprise. China has put $3.5 trillion into its ports in the last 10 years. Brazil has put $250 million developing the Acuport, which is bigger than the island of Manhattan. We don't even allow the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund to fully fund port development and dredging. Only 2 ports on the East Coast will be ready for Panamax. It's a disgrace. I don't want to hear anybody talk about American exceptionalism who is not ready to invest in our infrastructure. Building America's Future, the group that I founded along with Mayor Bloomberg of New York and Governor Schwarzenegger of California, we issued a report 2 years ago and updated it last year called Building America's Future, Falling Apart, Falling Behind. And let the record show we are falling apart, literally, and we are falling behind our competitor nations. Infrastructure is important for 3 reasons. It affects our public safety. We've seen that time and time again. It affects our quality of life. And most of all, it affects our economic competitiveness. Metallurgical coal is highly prized. It is the food substance for the production of coke. China has a need for metallurgical coal, despite the fact it's a big coal-producing country. It's found in Australia and the U.S. Both countries are high labor cost countries, but Australia can produce and send metallurgical coal to China for 1/4 the cost that the U.S. can, because they can move their metallurgical coal from where it's mined to their port cities infinitely faster and more efficiently and more capable than we do. Goods movement is one of the keys to economic competitiveness, and we are getting our brains beat in. Now, the American taxpayer understand that. The last 4 elections, last 4 federal elections, taxpayers have approved transportation initiatives by 61% in the tough year of 2010 and 77, 76, and 78% in the last 3 elections. It's red state, blue state, it doesn't matter. In Charleston, the voters voted to raise their own sales tax to make the Port of Charleston competitive, because Charlestonians understand that their economy depends on a viable, effective, efficient operating port. The American people get it. Not uniformly. There are some examples of referendums that are being turned down, but for the most part, they vote for tolling, taxes, or borrowing to finance infrastructure. The federal government can't do this alone. We understand that. States and local government provide 75% of current infrastructure funding, but the federal government must be a player. Let me draw your attention to one part of the stimulus that I think we'll all agree was enormously successful, and that was Tiger grants. Tiger grants were successful because for the first time, we had a vehicle for multi-state projects where states could band together, come in and ask the federal government for help for a project that benefited many of them. Pennsylvania participated, as you know, Chairman Schuster, in 2 projects, the National Gateway and the Crescent Corridor. The National Gateway and Crescent Corridor each had 6 states involved. One was Norfolk Southern and the other was CSX. They were responsible for opening up freight in the eastern half of the country. I was able to, with the help of my fellow governors, persuade a number of governors, all 6 of us, to go in and put our own state money in. The companies put in about 40% of the money. But these projects would not have been underway, producing good jobs, were it not for the Tiger grant program. Tiger gave funds to both programs, and they are both among the best things we've done for freight rail in this country in the last 50 years. Now, Building America's Future has some specific recommendations, and I know I'm running short on time. Let me run through them very quickly and then happy to answer questions.
Take your time.
First, we think there should be short-term boost in infrastructure spending. Above and beyond MAP 21, and I think the Congress did a good job on MAP 21, a lot of key reforms, speeding up the process, cutting down the delays in environmental regulations, the increase in funding for TIFIA. MAP 21 was a very good step in the right direction, but we need a short-term influx, I think along the lines that the President proposed. But if you do it, we suggest you put a rider in called use it or lose it. When we met with the President 2 months after his election in Philadelphia, we recommended use it or lose it. And by use it or lose it, I mean if a state doesn't get their share of that money out the door, if jobs aren't being created, if money isn't being put into roads or bridges, then the state should lose the money. Under current federal standards, if the state obligates the money, that's considered enough. But obligation doesn't mean work begins. It doesn't mean money is being spent. It doesn't mean jobs are created. You all know the impact of infrastructure spending. DOT and other experts estimate for every $1 billion of infrastructure spending, we create 25,000 well-paying jobs. And Congressman Rendell, jobs that cannot be outsourced, that are well-paying. And just think, if we did $50 billion like the President recommended, that's 1 million, over 1 million well-paying jobs that can't be outsourced. But we think that we need much more than that. We think we need to be able to step back and look at the long-term infrastructure needs of the country, not just transportation, but how about our electric grid? Think of all the jobs we'd create if we took every power line that's above ground and buried it. We'd never have a Sandy again. We'd never have a Nemo again. We wouldn't have people in danger of freezing to death. Just think of the jobs we'd create. Now, it's obviously an expensive proposition, but is it worth it? Well, you know, the CBO in 2008 in a study estimated that we could spend $180 billion a year more on infrastructure, and it could be justified by the economic and social and societal benefits that would be created. So we think, and we've written the President and asked for a commission appointed by the President and by legislative leaders to study and develop a 6-month study, quick study and develop ways, one, identify what our needs are, our real needs, set priorities, and figure out ways, funding suggestions to give the Congress and the administration a menu. Unfortunately, we haven't gotten a reply from the President to the letter we sent him on November 1st. But we think that type of commission with experts, former elected officials, academicians, people who know the business is a great idea. Next, we need an infrastructure bank. An infrastructure bank works. Ranking Member Rendell, you said you had the European folks in. The European Infrastructure Bank loans out hundreds of billions of dollars a year, and they make money. They not only cover their administrative costs, but they actually make a profit. Even though the interest they charge is fairly low, they make a profit. You could fund $50 billion of loan capacity for $5 billion. Under federal regulations, you only have to do $1 for every $10 of loan capacity. $5 billion would produce $50 billion. When you think of the success of the TIFIA program, and think of the demand that exists for TIFIA, to create an infrastructure bank that could loan out $50 billion, just think of the projects that would be undertaken by doing that. I know there are issues involved the infrastructure bank, but I think it's important enough we should resolve them. Tolling. You should lift the ban on states tolling formerly federal highways that were built with federal funding. Let me give you an example of a small state, Rhode Island. Rhode Island and Pennsylvania are two states that don't toll I-95. They grandfathered in all the states that tolled it at the time you passed the regulation barring state tolling. Rhode Island has enormous repair needs on 95. Tolling would produce $39 million a year for Rhode Island. With that $39 million flow, they could produce $500 million to repair I-95 along the stretch that goes through Rhode Island. Without it, they have no chance, and that stretch of 95 will continue to deteriorate. The same thing is true in Pennsylvania. You know that I applied for one of the slots to toll I-80, and I was turned down by the United States DOT. even though it's really the only way to continue to fund all of the needs in I-80 because of its elevation and the weather that it goes through. So unlock and free the states to toll their roads. I know there's a theory that you paid for it once, but yes, you pay for a car when you buy it, but you also pay to maintain it year after year after year. Tiger, we have to find a mechanism, maybe through the infrastructure bank, where we make money available for regional and multi-state projects, for projects that states can't do alone. And you can't build, for those people who say, let's get out of the business, federal government. Well, think about it. You can't have 50 separate highway systems, because if you go through Pennsylvania, you've got to get through to Ohio. If you take a freight train through a state, the freight train's got to have a compatible rail bed to go through to the next state. You've got to have a vehicle, and it's very important to create a vehicle to replace Tiger. Tiger produced the best in transportation projects, the most meaningful, well-prioritized projects. Gas tax. I know it's a difficult time to consider taxes, but I think we have to fund our transportation system, and I think the inescapable reality is, for the short term, that will require an increase in the gas tax. Over the long term, we can have a form of vehicle miles travel tax, and there are unobtrusive ways of doing so. The technology is literally being developed that can do it in a non-intrusive way as we sit here and speak. And lastly, BABS. BABS, Building America bonds, was an enormously successful part of stimulus as well. The federal government helps states defray the cost of their own borrowing. The states still pay the majority of the cost of the borrowing, but because the federal government participates, it doesn't have to, if it's $100 billion, the federal government doesn't pay $100 billion, the states pay the lion's share of it. But that extra help on paying off the debt service for BABS made BABS incredibly popular and incredibly useful for the states. So there are ways we can help, and let me conclude by saying two things. Number one, you're both right. There has to be a continuing federal role for all of the reasons I discussed, and you're going to hear from Mr. Donahue and Mr. O'Sullivan. There has to be a continued federal role. Number two, American exceptionalism. If we believe in it, if it's not just words, if it's not just puffing, it's time to put our money where our mouth is.
Thank you, Governor.